But thanks for doing this. Thanks for doing this for KUOI. I've been trying to make jazz a more present thing at KUOI, and I think this is a perfect way to do that with someone who studied with who again?
Many people, but my hero and mentor was the great saxophonist Lee Konitz.
Yeah.
And I was close to him the last 12 years of his life. But I also studied with, Barry Harris, the great bebop pianist.
Yeah.
I went to his classes, on and off for almost 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Not in like an obsessive way, but knowing there was a lot to gain from it,
Yeah. How were you able to connect with this generation of players?
Well, some of it was through college. When I was a student at UNC Chapel Hill, Jim Ketch, great educator, one of my heroes and idols, he would bring in guest artists for the jazz festival and for the jazz students. Then the year I started there, we had a bunch of us, like 16 of us, that were really serious about music. And I was older than everyone else because I'd already gone to Elon. But he brought in Barry Harris for a week. And so we just got to be around him all day and all night, play a concert with him, do jam sessions, little theory lessons, and it changed my life. It changed the way I think about music. So the following summer I moved to New York City, and I lived in the NYU dorms, and I just went to his classes and studied with musicians while I was there. And there were other opportunities. I played with Conrad Herwig and Slide Hampton. It's part of the university system. But then when I went to graduate school in the University of Maryland in D.C., or outside of D.C., I thought I wanted to continue that and provide that for my students and for my community. So I just started reaching out. I was a curator, and I brought Barry Harris in, I brought Gretchen Parlato with Robert Glasper, Jonathan Kreisberg's trio, Ari Honig, different people that were around working a lot that time. And then when I graduated, I just kept doing it. I started a big band, and because I was so close to New York, I would drive up to New York every week. My girlfriend and I, we would go to Barry Harris's class for 6 hours, 6 p.m. till 12 or 1 a.m., 2 hours of piano, 2 hours of voice, 2 hours of improvisation. And then we'd go down to the village and get a cappuccino. She would sleep in the car because she taught elementary school, and then I taught community college at night. So I'd drive, and we get home at 7 a.m., and we'd do it every week. But then that was just Tuesdays. On the weekends, we'd drive back up to go hear Lee play at the Vanguard or at Birdland, and we'd study with him and watch a Yankees game, in his apartment. Wow. And go get food. And I just did that, and I kept reaching out and connecting with more people, and I had the wherewithal and the interest in going to that source. And so by living in D.C., I had something to offer these musicians and my community. I could create performances with locals and bring these guest artists in, and it created something unique. And so that's kind of how I worked it. And then I started curating at another performing arts center, bringing artist collaborations, working with Gratian Moncur III, Teddy Charles, Andrew Cyril. Forgetting all the things I've done now, but that's what I've tried to do for the last couple of years.
Yeah, I've always wondered, comparing generations of musicians, like the attitude around, I guess not only jazz but just music in general. The attitude and the sentiment that folks like Lee Konitz and Barry Harris had around music. How is that compared to today's attitude around music? Like, what is the defining difference?
Well, I think what I've been saying this whole week is that people like Barry and Lee were monoliths. And most of my generation and younger are trained to be musicians and hireable, workable musicians. Mm-hmm. And so when I look at my upbringing, it was like, okay, you got to be able to play bossa novas, waltzes, funk tunes, preparing me to play wedding bands, salsa gigs, cocktail hours.
Yeah, jack of all trades.
Yeah, but it was an effort to have a career in music by any means necessary, and that didn't resonate with me. So when I found someone like Lee who did his thing on his terms and at such a high level, what I took from that was the sincerity and the passion and the love for not only what they did or how they approached it, but why they approached it and how important they thought it was to pass that along. Mm-hmm. Barry Harris said he was so moved by hearing Charlie Parker in Detroit in the 50s when he was a kid. Mm-hmm. And he said that feeling of hearing Bird play impacted him so much that he chased that feeling and he couldn't find it anywhere else. Mm-hmm. So he decided he had to give that feeling to himself.
Wow.
And by studying Charlie Parker's music and then by passing that along. Yeah. And that's how I felt about Lee. I didn't play alto very much when I was playing with Lee and studying. I was playing tenor because I wanted to be Warren Marsh, to his.
Sure.
And I was working with Ted Brown, and we were playing two tenor stuff. And I thought, why am I going to play alto when Lee Konitz and Ornette Coleman are alive? Why would I do that?
Mm-hmm.
And so when Lee died, I felt a bigger hole in my life and wanting that same feeling that Barry described. Mm-hmm. So I started playing alto again. As every note I play is an homage to Lee, and to Ted, and to Freddie, and whoever I got to work with. So I think giving that feeling to myself, and not that I'm imitating Lee or I'm trying to do what he did, but he did imprint on me that he was. I keep saying this. He gave me permission. He used to say that about Lenny, but he gave me permission to be myself, to be vulnerable, to really improvise, and so that's what I try to give to my students, no matter what style they decide to play, but just to be honest and not to have to be everything to everybody.
Mm-hmm. That feeling around Bird, I mean, I hear it all the time in different players, and I heard somewhere that Lee Konitz believed that the only people that were worth transcribing were Bird and Louis Armstrong.
Well, that was a thing from Lenny. Lenny thought, you study the masters to figure out what a great solo feels like. So Lenny would say Louis Armstrong, Charlie Christian, Lester Young, Fats Navarro. And, the early guys were first, and then you might move on to Fats or Dizzy or Bird or Bud Powell. But, those guys were masters. And to sing the solos, internalize them, then put them on your instrument, that was internalizing what a great solo feels like. Not imitating the licks or the, but really getting a deeper feeling for the mannerisms and the freedom of it. That's what we all, Chase is not Bird's necessarily his vocabulary, but his freedom to improvise. Bird felt untethered when he played.
Right.
And I think that's what people sometimes fall short of. They get all the language, but then they forget how loose Bird was. He could play with time. He played with melody. For me, there was romance in his playing. And that's another difference, I think. Lee and Barry and Bird came out of a time, that was a little more romantic, these beautiful Tin Pan Alley tunes.
Yeah, very suave.
Yeah, I mean, and the lyrics to those songs, Lee talks about transcribing Frank Sinatra. He told me to get up songs for swinging lovers and Only the Lonely and sing along to how Frank, and I thought, when I was younger, I was like, Frank's easy listening. That's what my parents listened to.
Yeah.
Frank Sinatra is deep as can be and swinging, and that I feel like an old man saying that, but I enjoy it very much. And so that's, that was Lee's reverence. And Lee loved Charlie Parker so much that he wouldn't copy him.
Yeah. Just let Bird exist.
Yeah, and that's what Bird, Lee, there's documentation of Lee saying this, but he said, he knew Charlie Parker. And then he said they were at the Apollo Theater one night, and Charlie Parker came up to him and said, hey, thanks for playing your own stuff, and that meant a lot to Lee.
Yeah, I believe that. What I always think about, too, is that musicians today have all the resource in the world to get better. Mm-hmm. And you see that, there are a lot more musicians, I think, in this world because just the flow of information and access to anything and everything music. Yet, there's something about the level of talent that existed back then that could exist without those resources. And that's always really fascinating to me, like folks like Clifford Brown, for instance. That level of talent, and Lee Morgan, too, at such a young age, to achieve that level at such a young age with far less resource than folks do now.
But I think it's it's a trade-off. So these iconic musicians weren't concerned with going to college and going to graduate school and getting a doctorate. They were out on the road all the time. They were playing every night of the week, and they were playing with people of the same caliber. You know what I mean? So I think that's something that apprenticeship thing is kind of lost.
Yeah.
And I also, it's also about where you are. Like here we are out in Moscow and Pullman, and I'm talking to these students at Washington State, and I'm going, I'm just telling them how lucky I am to have been on the East Coast and be in North Carolina. I used to take the train up from Greensboro to Smalls, and I'd pay $10 at 8 p.m., and this was the old Smalls, and you could go in, and I'd sit in the back of the room. There was no bar. They had juice and cookies in the back. It was filled with smoke. But for $10, I could stay all night, so I wouldn't get a hotel. I'd have my horn with me. I'd clutch some records I bought, and I'd pass out on a couch. I remember going to hear Jason Lindner's big band with, I think Joel Fromm was in it that night, and I passed out, because I was tired, and I woke up, and then it was Myron Walden playing or whatever, and I just, dozed off, and I woke up a couple hours later, and it was Frank Hewitt playing piano with a trio, and then at 8 a.m., they'd kick you out, and I'd walk around, and I'd maybe I'd check into a hotel, or I'd
Yeah.
go walk around the park or go to a museum, and then I'd take the train home. But I just had to be a part of that music. And now a lot of my students, I teach high school, but they just go on YouTube. Right, and they feel like that substitutes for going to hear live music. And here's the problem: we listen to these records, like Hank Mobley's Soul Station, or, pick whatever record, iconic record, and you hear what they're playing, you learn the language, but it wasn't like that. That's like a Jurassic Park moment. It's just frozen in amber. But the music is living and breathing, and it's different every time.
Yeah.
So I get really concerned when I think about people who only see things frozen in a moment, and they're not going to see how it evolves. And that's what's supposed to be so fascinating or satisfying about improvised music, is that it's different every time.
Yeah.
And if you're not seeing it unfold, then you can get caught in the minutia of licks and patterns and how it's supposed to be. Saying to the students, it's not one way; it's different ways. Like my way is not the same as Dr. Aaron Hill, my dear friend. But it's the way that is honest to me, and I think that's where we have to get. Aaron reminds me that I spent a lot of time learning, scales and bebop language, and now I kind of ignored that. Not ignored it, but put emphasis on creativity and really starting from scratch. But having a bunch in the bank from 20 years of 30 years of. I sound really old, but I'm not. But you know what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, I think that's a feeling I've had being a musician in Boise, specifically being more interested in jazz, is like that kind of scene doesn't exist yet. I think slowly it's coming into fruition, jazz being presented more in Boise. But yeah, I think it's frustrating being so disconnected from the the hot spots of this music and other styles of music. And so, like, what can musicians do to create that environment for themselves? Or how can a scene be created in a place where there is none?
Well, I think that's the key. I mean, that's what I talked about with the students. It's that the whole point of Matt, I talk about Matt Wilson a lot because he's such a great cheerleader for the music. He's such a great band leader, educator, person, and he always poses these open-ended questions to he has a character he dresses up as called the allower, and he says allow for things to happen. And he said something one time, we were in the car, and he was like, we don't need more Lincoln Centers and SF Jazz Collectives. We need smaller performing arts centers and scenes all over America. He would love to go to like West Virginia, find a little bar, he'd be to the university and say, we should play a gig here tonight.
Yeah.
It's not about the money at that point. It's about creating community. And I admire and love Matt for that. And the people I surround myself with have that same attitude. So what I did, I took that inspiration. Growing up in rural North Carolina, I had to do that. I started my own band when I was in high school. We'd go play at middle school and elementary school lunches, playing jazz music. I had these little Dave Wolpe 8 horn, or 8 count arrangements of, silly old tunes, and we're just doing it, and just to get it out there. And so the same thing in D.C. Somebody said to me once, they said, Brad, because I'm not a D.C. native. They said, you came here whenever, and you didn't ask anybody's permission. You just started doing things and creating a scene. And I said to my friend, it was a dear friend that said this to me. I said, well, why would I wait for anybody's permission? I'm an adult. I'm an artist, and I see the need for something. And so that's why I brought all these people down, connected my students to Rand Blake, to Barry Harris, took my students to see Lee Konitz, brought Wadada Leo Smith to D.C. to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and then brought him to my school and had him, he inspired this little 6th grader. She came to high school years later, and I said, hey, Claire, why don't you play a solo piece for us, first day of school? And she played this super avant-garde thing on a soprano sax, and my jaw just hit the ground. I said, where did you come up with that? She goes, well, when I was in 6th grade, Wadada Leo Smith came to school, and he played free, and she goes, I'd never thought about music that way, and my eyes welled up. I thought, that is exactly what it's about.
Yeah.
And so trying to continue that. So what I would say to you guys way out here in Boise, and it's up to you. Macy sitting over there is already doing it. She has a big band. She's going to the sessions. She's creating community between Idaho and Washington, and that's it. So then you just keep doing it. You keep growing your circle, and then you do things like, like who you admire. Reach out to them now.
Right.
You know, I met Lee when I was in like 2003. He didn't have a business card. I asked him a stupid question at the Jazz Stand or the Iridium. I said, "Hey, do you have what kind of mouthpiece is that?" And he was like, and I said, "Can I take a lesson?" He's like, I don't have a card on me, right? And then about 4 years later, I met him again, and I said, "Hey, can I take a lesson with you?" And he reached into his pocket, and he goes, "Well, I've got this one random card in my pocket," and I called him, and that's what started the whole
Wow.
thing.
So
it's just like, you know, you don't need to be in New York or Boston,
No.
but you could do it all right here. Just, you know, get your grant writer over there, and you know, get funding, and call up like whoever your contemporary hero is,
Mm-hmm.
or somebody of you in the area that fills that position. You know, I think Brent Jensen's a great example of someone who's been doing it for a long time and creating community. He invited me, you know, to play at Boxley's and do a house concert with Bill Anshel, and that's beautiful, and that's what it's all. It's all about connecting people, and sincerely though, you know, I would never ask anybody to do something that was out of their comfort zone stylistically.
Yeah.
You know, and you never want to work. You know, people say never meet your heroes. That's about half and half.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've had great experiences, and if they're not great people, then maybe they're not your heroes anymore in
Right.
some way.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying you can't separate the art from the artist. You know, we have to do that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. Like if I live in D.C. I loved having the opportunity to come out here and work with students at WSU, to meet Brent and Bill and the gang at Boxley's, to come out here and do an interview with you,
Mm-hmm.
to hang out with the students like Jacob and Anna and Macy and Rachel and everybody. And so that's cool.
Yeah.
And I would do it again. Like if some, I mean, and I'm just, you know, we always say, I'm just like mildly jazz famous, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so I you know, I get a phone call to do these things. Cool. But yeah, you know, I would do it. I love doing it.
Yeah.
And so do it, you know. I was telling Jacob over at WSU, I said, call Joel Fromm. If you're really, he's in Texas now, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Take up, you know, a collection, you know, at all your gigs, and get Joel out here for a couple of days. Take
Mm-hmm.
some lessons, play a gig with him, you know. I mean, I'm sure, and Joel's such a great person, he would love to.
Yeah.
Because we all want to work, and we all want to
Right.
pass it along, and we feel an obligation. I mean, at least I do. I've kind of been a teacher before I was a musician, but you know, we want to share this music. We want to.
Right.
We want to lift, Matt says, lift the bandstand, but we want to lift the scene.
Mm-hmm.
And that's already happening. That's cool.
Yeah, very. Well, touching on a point you said earlier that I've thought about before, like the idea that, like, you know, we don't need another Jazz in Lincoln Center and
Yeah.
SF Jazz and whatnot. That idea of just playing at places just to play at them, I think is interesting, and you see that a lot in the older generation. Like, for instance, Louis Armstrong, he came here, I believe it was 1963, for the opening of the ballroom right below
very
us.
Cool.
And it's like, well, I mean, like a peak of his career, you know, like a cultural icon of all places. He's in Moscow, Idaho.
Right.
And I think at some point Duke Ellington came here and performed at a club that no longer exists in Moscow. And I remember hearing a story about the trumpet professor here, Vern Seeler, seeing Red Garland at the small club in North Texas called the Green Parrot. And, you know, just finding these jazz legends in common places like that, I feel like that humbleness is so important. Yeah, it just kind of insinuates like this yearn to play no matter what.
Well, it's getting harder, you know, because we're getting further away from the genesis of this music. I was lucky to catch the tail end of some of the, you know, the originators like Lee, and you know, I rediscovered Freddie Redd, a bebop pianist out in California. He was living in Hollywood, and I was teaching his music, and I said, hey, could we get some of your charts? And he helped me get some access to his music, and I said, well, no, that's not enough. Everybody has access to Freddie's music. I want access to Freddie. I want to know why he plays the way he does or writes the way he does. So I flew him out to D.C. and we went out and played 2 nights at Smalls, and it was a huge homecoming for him. And then he ended up moving to the East Coast, and we worked together and made a record. But Freddie said when he was in New York in the 50s, John Orr, the bass player with Monk, had a station wagon. They would put his bass in the station wagon, and I think he and Shadow Wilson, the drummer, they'd drive around New York City, and they'd go to a bar that had a piano and say, hey, you should have music here. And the owner would be like, well, we can't pay you. He goes, let us play 1 or 2 nights, and if we start bringing in a crowd, then you start paying us. And that's what they do.
Yeah.
And they go around from just looking for a piano to play. So they had that idea of what to do, you know. I worked with a bass player for years in North Carolina and up in D.C. We were very close. And he got to a point where he goes, I'm not leaving the house for less than $150. And I said, you're not leaving the house. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because some musicians can't separate service industry from art.
Yeah.
And it's like, yes, I'm not going to do a wedding for free, but I'll play at an art space the music I want to play with my colleagues and friends for the door.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I think that's, we need to have more of a DIY punk rock attitude. Just get it together and you do it because you have to.
Yeah. Well, it's part of it. It's part of like the process of getting better. And I remember thinking in high school when I would play around and stuff. I don't think I ever started getting paid for things until college, that age. And I mean, I remember in high school being like, what am I doing these free gigs for? Like, I deserve to get paid. We sound good enough to get paid. And I think maybe that'd be true, but it's not so much about that. It's more just playing with people. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that catapults you into sounding better.
Well, that's like the practical side of it. I'm talking about the inability to ignore it. I studied with this tenor saxophone player at Banff. I went to Banff in 2013, and his name was Hafez. And I actually met him years before when I went to take a lesson with Ornette Coleman in Manhattan, and he was there. And so we were reunited, and I remember him saying to the class, he said he stopped playing for 5 years. He got burned out or whatever, and he was miserable. And so what he realized when he went back to playing was, if you don't play, it doesn't matter. He said, but if you do play, it matters. It matters to you. It matters to the people around you. It matters to the world. And you never know who you might change their lives through music. And I get melodramatic and say music saved my life, but my parents aren't musicians. My grandfather was a saxophonist, but music gave me a purpose. And Aaron said to me the other day, he goes, I think Brad would die for music. That's even more melodramatic. But the truth is, I've lost some of my closest friendships over music because I could not forgive people not taking it as seriously as me. And that's wild, like I'm talking about how much it's about community and love and honesty, and I'm saying, you know what, if you're not going to come along with me, I don't know how we can connect anymore.
Right.
That's crazy. Yeah. That's crazy, but it's a compulsion at some point. I have to do it. I don't even want to. Sometimes I don't even want to do it, but I still have to.
If you weren't necessarily surrounded by it, how did you find yourself in it? Just the natural inclination to seek it, or?
My grandfather gave me an alto saxophone when I was 10 years old, and I've heard jazz music and I liked it, and then I loved the freedom of improvising, and then I just had to do. Everybody's got to do something. That's the old Jerry Seinfeld joke.
Sure.
The guy comes home, and his wife's with another man, but he finds him hiding in the shower. And he says, what are you doing here? And the guy says, everybody's got to be somewhere. And so that's kind of the same thing. It's like everybody's got to do something, right?
Yeah.
And so what else would I do? Maybe I would have been a visual artist, just as unmarketable and frustrated, right?
Yeah.
But I'd have to, some kind of form of self-expression. Yeah, and I teach high school. I teach at a wonderful place in D.C. called Georgetown Day School. I have 60, 70 students of just jazz and creative instrumental music. I have vocalists now. And that's a day job, but I still feed my passion, and I get to pass that along and see the light bulbs go on. And I'm giving my students the same experience that I gave to myself and that Jim Ketch gave to me. And I'm taking them out on the road with me, and I'm bringing in guest artists for them to hobnob with. I remember a young clarinetist. She was a freshman. I said, "Who's your favorite?" She was really serious about it. I said, "Who's your favorite clarinet player?" And she goes, "Not Cohen." And I went, "What?" And Not Cohen was playing in Maryland like 2 weeks later. So I got a bunch of tickets for the kids, and we went. And
That's
afterwards,
great.
we went up, and they got to meet her and ask her questions, sign CDs, and that makes a difference.
Yeah.
I mean, again, pretty populated circuit, on the East Coast, but those kinds of moments are. You got to show up. You got to make the scene. Not only do you have to create it, but you just have to be on it.
Yeah.
And that's, you asked me how I meet Lee Konitz and all that. I just showed up. And I kept showing up to the point where Dan Tepfer and Lee and they were like, when are we going to play gigs together? I said, okay, that's the next step.
Yeah. Being surrounded by students so much and so often all over the place, is there any continuity you see in attitude around music?
I think it's changing.
Yeah,
I'm finding just a difference in post-COVID world, experience, in ensembles and things like that. I find people, the Spotify thing. I'm sorry, I know we have the whole history of humanity in our phones,
right?
But that doesn't substitute for going out and meeting people, and seeing and playing with people, and contributing to society. So I find that attitude shifting. Post Charlie Parker, the music fractured into so many different directions.
Sure.
He died in 1955, and that was like. Not the end of bebop, but hard bop. Cool had already happened. hard bop was emerging.
Mhm.
But then you get fusion, free,
Yeah.
soul jazz, whatever was happening in the 70s and 80s,
Mhm.
and then so there was never one beacon. Coltrane was the next closest thing, but he died, only 12 years later.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say what jazz is. I was telling the students, maybe I was telling Dr. Hill, but it's like nobody else, no other style of music is responsible for 100 years of different styles. So what I mean by that is, I used to play with a bass player in DC. We played, I've always been like a post-cool free bopper, even though I didn't know it at the time. But he'd lean over and say, "We haven't played anything in 3 tonight." And I'd say, "I don't, okay." And then he'd go, "What bossa novas do you know?" I'm like, "Why are we doing this? I don't go hear Metallica and go, where are they going to play a shuffle tonight?" Aerosmith didn't do any waltzes. It's like Biggie and Tupac never recorded a samba.
The theater number.
Right. So the thing is like, why are we responsible for that? And my heroes did. Monk played Monk's music, some Ellington and choice standards. He didn't concern himself with Blakey or Don Cherry or whoever.
Right.
And Lee played the 32 bar standards of. He used to say his Jewish soul loved minor keys, and he loved those songs from his upbringing, the Broadway song.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do as my heroes did. Not exactly what they did, but I just don't think that's a service industry attitude, that you have to something for everyone. And again, I'm sure maybe bass players like playing bossa novas or in 3. Why not, right? I don't feel the compulsion to do it. Let the people who love it do it.
Mm-hmm.
Ben Riley said, Monk told him that the person who loves the song the most has the right tempo. That's real. Mm-hmm. And tempos have meaning. And so, like, why am I going to fake some feeling for a music that I haven't put the love and time into?
I always think about the varying genre names and how much merit they have. And I was curious about your opinion on that, like how we categorize this stuff. Is it worth categorizing like that? Or
I think to market it is.
Sure.
I used to work at Borders, the bookstore that went out of business, and you have to put something somewhere, and it has to go. Well, same Seinfeld joke. You have to put R&B, pop. What's pop music even mean? Mm-hmm. Jazz, adult contemporary. When we talk about smooth jazz and instrumental pop or whatever you want to call it, but listeners, they follow the bands they like. They don't necessarily follow trends. Or I think I keep bringing up Metallica, but in the early 2000s they came out with some album, everybody went, "Ooh," because they changed something, and so you don't have to ride or die till the end with the things you like. But what does the word jazz mean? When I hear that word, I get
3 more hours to this.
Well, yeah, I just get weird about it, because obviously I'm a jazz musician, but I'm saying, like, there's a certain expectation. We were talking about players on because of social media you were talking about, and the difference I see in music. A lot of players just play to be transcribed. I don't play that way. I hope no one ever transcribes me, because for me it's just what's happening in the moment, not see how cool I am and how many licks I can play, and maybe I can sell a PDF book or something,
right?
Or how can I squeeze in all these things I've played by myself for hours and hours and hours with a bass player or drummer that has never heard it or doesn't care, or it has nothing to do. I'm making phone calls, but what I'm saying is I just that's just not real to me. I'm not interested in practicing the saxophone that much, and I still need some kind of humanity in my playing and in my surroundings, and I want to play with the people. This will never happen again. The music I made last night with the kids at WSU will never happen again, and I'll always carry that with me as a unique experience. Mm-hmm. I told the students before, when I said, let this change you, and whatever let me being here change you just like you're changing me, and then the next thing will change you, and then that's how you develop your own sound and your own style. Or why do it? My
method of categorizing musicians has always been, I guess more specifically in jazz, is like there's the type of musician who is good at what they do and they stick with that, and that is their career. Mm-hmm. And folks like Oscar Peterson come to mind, and Chet Baker, for instance. Like, you listen to them at one point and you listen to them at the other point, and in terms of like approach and style, there's not a huge difference.
Right.
And then you have folks like Miles Davis, where you listen to his work with Lee Konitz, or his stuff with Charlie Parker and whatnot, and then you listen to him in the mid '70s, and then you listen to him with David Sanborn and stuff like that. And that's kind of been my way of separating the two.
But when I was younger, like, I loved Sonny Stitt. I bought every record I could find, and the reason I loved him is he was consistent. Yeah. And so I always knew what I was getting. But then I'm sitting here with 70 Sonny Stitt records going, They all sound similar, you know. I'm not
Sure.
gonna say the same, and I didn't like people like Lee who played this light, exciting bebop early on, and then he got freer as he got older.
Yeah.
But then as I got older, I went, wait a minute, look at this journey, look at this evolution of the artist. That's real, you know. That's not getting stuck. That's not. Of course, Sonny Stitt could play faster than most people, because he was dealing with the same materials over the course of
Right.
however many decades. Same thing with, but the same could be said of Lee. Lee was dealing with 12 arbitrary number, a small amount of standards, and just but he was approaching them differently every time. You know, that's the difference in players. There's some players that approach all kinds of different tunes the same way,
Right.
where my heroes would approach the same tune different ways. And again, that's kind of putting it in a tidy little box, but really improvising in the moment with the people you're around. The story I've been telling all week is someone asked Lee one time, they said, why don't you sound like you did when you were with Stan Kenton? And Lee just goes, because I'm not with Stan Kenton. So again, having that influence from the people around him. You know, and I get bored. Like last night we were playing a tune, big band tune, and I'm just sitting there like an idiot, you know, while everybody else is playing. So I start, you know, I start making my own little backgrounds,
Sure.
Comping behind them. I encourage tandem solos so that, you know, if we go back to the beginning of jazz, you think about counterpoint with trumpet, clarinet, and trombone.
Yeah.
Right? They're collectively improvising. What joy!
Yeah.
Right? And so why
yeah.
not have Jacob and Macy come down front and play almost like an improvised, you know, invention together? How much more interesting is that than one solo?
Yeah, it's
You
true.
know, I don't know. You play alone all the time.
Right.
So why not enjoy your relationships? And then you hear differently. You're inspired. I don't like piano players that just comp. I want to hear interaction. There's a great piano player in North Carolina named Kevin Timmons, and I loved playing with him because he would interact. He always gave me something to play off of. You know, and this is when I was like trying to play like George Coleman or whatever, playing Wayne tunes and Miles tunes and stuff like that. That was the thread that stayed with me my whole life. I want people who are listening and organically creating, and not just plugging in ideas that they worked on alone and chugging along.
That's what I think about with like Wayne Shorter. I remember listening to him talk about the more beginnings of his career. It was he played with Jazz and Lincoln Center, and they played Yes or No. And he talks about the difficulty going up against his former self, like his 1964 self versus whatever year that was, 2019, 2020, I'm not sure. But yeah, like approaching something that he had been doing that he had written 6 decades ago and coming back to it as a completely different player. You know, there's 60 years of context that he's lived in afterward, and I thought that was really interesting because, it's that essence of him still exists all these years later, but it's his 30-year-old self versus his 80-year-old self.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, your life experiences change. A teacher said to me years ago, he said, the things that are important to you now may not be important to you later.
Yeah.
As a 22-year-old kid, but I went, okay, don't fall in love with, you know, everything too deeply because things change.
I remember seeing Cher saying, if it doesn't matter in 5 years, it just doesn't matter. I remember seeing it about talking about that.
That's
stuck with me.
But you know, that's why we have to keep doing it. Dr. Hill asked me why I continue to do these things, and I gave the wrong answer. I said, because it's a compulsion, and I think he was looking for me to say because I love it. Well, obviously I love it, but sometimes I don't want to do it. It's like getting up and going to work. You know, you don't want to go to school. You don't want to do homework, but you have to for certain outcomes. But for me, I said it took me half my life to figure out who I am, and it's going to take the second half of my life to be okay with that. And so that's why I do what I do, because I know I can. I don't even get worried about it. Even if things are falling off the rails, I go, you know what? I've got enough experience that it's going to be okay. I trust myself.
Lived this long.
Yeah, well, even when I don't know all the moving parts and I feel like things are going wrong, I go, you know what? I know I can do this. And it's not like some kind of throne or something. I'm just saying that, you know, and then I get done with it and I go, what's next? You know, like, oh, that was a great Matt Wilson thing I heard last year. He said, you know, people would call him up and he'd go, that's a terrible idea. What time? You know, and that you know, Matt, that's why I love Matt, because he's just ready to do whatever and just make music. The Bad Plus, you know, even and then they said they would play like Saturday nights or whatever in Brooklyn. They drove trucks, they worked at Staples or whatever they did, but they would never sub out that gig. They could call for $500. Nope. And that's how they developed their sound and their repertoire, and they committed to it.
Yeah.
And that's a part of it too. Just prioritizing in this moment what you want out of life. And I talked to a young composer last night after the concert, and she's like, I loved your piece, and I want to be a composer, and this is what I want to do." And I said, "Well, if I can do it, anybody can do it." And it's again, I'm fortunate to live on the East Coast. I never realized how much that matters because I'm in proximity, and a train ride to DC from New York is much cheaper than a
plane ride from
Alaska Air. Yeah, but I would not let any of those things stop anybody. And all of our heroes and all of our opportunities are all humans and human constructs. So like, there's no reason you can't do exactly what you want to do. I mean, there's all kinds of obstacles, but I don't know. I've probably been in. I put a lot of hotels and airplanes on a credit card, getting to play with Freddie Red and Lee and Gray. All these things. And I said, you know what? In 20 years, I'll remember playing with Lee Konitz. I'm not going to remember the $2,000 or whatever.
Of course.
Money comes and goes. The pandemic was a perfect example of who knows what's going to happen. So why not?
Absolutely.
So I think like you guys out here, you're already doing it, and if you want to do more of it, do more of it. And if you don't know how, ask somebody, and if they don't know, ask somebody else. But all in the essence of making informed canonical choices. Do as your heroes did, not what they did.